Emergency 1. Rotate, and we'll get it moving. Nice and gently, much easier than I was doing with my Xbox controller. And rotating up towards the... Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot. I'm a real world 787 pilot and today I am taking a look at the Thrustmaster TCA Yoke Pack Boeing edition.
No way. It's actually a 7.8.
There you go, you can hear my excitement. They actually put a 787 on the box. I was very excited to see this, as was our first officer, who of course was thrilled that a box arrived in the shape, in such a large shape. It's quite a big setup this, quite a big box that arrives. There she is, complaining as ever. But there we go, the TCA Yoke Pack Boeing edition. Thrustmaster claims is a one-to-one representation of the Boeing 787 yoke, and as I fly that every day, I thought it would be very fitting to take a look at it on the channel and see what I think of it. There's a few big features about this yoke compared to a normal sort of joystick add-on. Firstly, it is one-to-one, so it is the right size. Secondly, all metal inside the yoke to give it the proper weight, and it has that pendulum sort of motion, which we'll talk about throughout the video. I'm going to talk about whether this feels like the real thing, and does it handle, does it behave and respond like the real thing as well. So here you can see some setup instructions about adjusting the springs. You can adjust the tension in the yoke itself to make it feel heavier. Spoiler alert, I will recommend you put as many springs in it as it comes with, because the heavier the better really for these sorts of controls. Lots of other little bits in the box, but this is the throttle quadrant that it comes with when you get the yoke, the whole pack as it were. Only 3 channels on this, so you can choose to have a flap lever as you see there, or what I later do is put the speed brake on it instead. So I have 2 throttles and a speed brake. A little autopilot control, which is quite clever. Again, I'll talk about that later on. And here is the thrust lever. It's modeled on the 787 thrust lever, and it has a little disconnect and a reverse lever on it as well. And again, that will be covered later in the video where I'll show you how that functions and how it compares to the real one. A few extra bits, and here's the speed brake lever also included. Nice, they gave you the customization options in the box. Now this is me trying to, and failing to get the yoke out of the box. It's really big and heavy because I didn't realize at this point that it actually has the metal construction inside. So it is a big chunky thing. But I've got to say the quality and finish on it was very nice. I was pleasantly surprised. Not always the case with hardware for flight simulators. This is my first time looking at it, and you can see licensed by Boeing, so the Boeing logo is on there, and a little gear lever on the right there. And yeah, I'm very, very impressed with the shape and feel of it. These are the springs I'm talking about. Again, I'm going to talk all about how I think it compares later on, but those springs, you can see the mechanism in there for the pendulum. Very clever, because it makes it feel more like the real aircraft in terms of the way the motion works. But I add the extra spring in, so I have all 4 springs on there to give it the full weight. Here it is mounted to my desk. As you can see, it comes out a bit forward and a bit lower down. Good range of motion as well. Thrustmaster are proud of how much that moves. But by the way, the yoke is a one-to-one representation, but the throttles are not. They're a bit smaller, although they do have some features to make them feel like the real one, which I will talk about later in the video. But yeah, also these aileron trim switches on the right are not on the real one. Here you go, this is the throttle autopilot control, which you can spin around to select your channel, and some assignable buttons. Of course, you can assign all these axes and buttons to whatever you want. And in this set, you actually get a remarkably large amount of axes, buttons, and little controls. I'm quite impressed with that. Thrustmaster say they've carefully measured the friction on the real 787 throttle quadrant to make these match. So it's very hard for me to remember exactly, but they do feel really nice. The one thing I noticed about the throttle quadrant out of the box was how nice and smooth those throttles felt, and the weight and resistance of them as you move them up and down on the gate. And same for the speed brake lever, although I've got to say this speed brake lever is a lot easier to use than the one in the real aircraft, which is a bit of a nightmare to get out of its gate for me, I find, compared to the one on the Airbus anyway. So first of all, let's take a look at this yoke in use in the PMDG Boeing 777-300ER, recently of course released for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and a very popular airplane, so one I'm sure this will be used in. They call it the Boeing yoke, although it is a one-to-one representation of the 787 yoke, which is obviously particularly good news for me, as the 787 is the aircraft that I fly every day at work. But it is very useful for the 777. Remember, they share a type rating in lots of parts of the world, so it is going to be a very similar setup, and it is indeed, as I'll show in this video. But let's see how you might have this setup flying either of the long-haul Boeing twins, the 777 or the 787. So first of all, obviously pitch and roll are assigned by default to these axes. So how does it feel for that? Well, the movement is excellent. As you can see, it moves just the right amount to match the real aircraft yoke. So as I move it, it can, to scale, match it, which is a real treat, and that is super. Feels great to me. Whether it's a few degrees different from the real aircraft, I couldn't tell you. It is a nice amount of range on the roll. Something else I like about the roll is it does have a nice weight to it. It's a smooth weight. It's not as light as the Airbus TCA over here. is a little bit light, I would find, compared to the Airbus side stick. But this is, although it is not as heavy as the real aircraft are particularly heavy on the Boeing long haul jets. It is still a reasonable weight, especially as you get into the higher range. My only criticism would be a lack of weight in the center point. Now there is a dead zone by default, and I'm going to keep that in for the reason I'm about to show you. So what my point is as you get out here, there's a good weight to the control. It feels nice and heavy, and it doesn't feel bad around here. It just feels lighter. The real yoke is actually very heavy on the 787 certainly, so I think it's a little bit lighter than the real one. However, it is a decent resistance and it does feel nice quality. As you will see though, just in the very center point, if I release the yoke, it wobbles like that, something the real aircraft just does not do. This comes from using springs to provide the tension, as opposed to dampeners like you would find in the real aircraft. So yeah, it's just spring based back to the center. Considering it is just springs, I think they've done a fantastic job, and it feels really nice. You don't ever in a real aircraft do that. You don't let go of it, so you never notice. But it just bothers me a little bit that in the setup it's just sitting there like that. However, as you can see with the dead zone that they have by default, it doesn't actually affect the use of the roll axes. Now let's look at the pitch axes, where it moves forward and backwards. This I really like. I love this pendulum effect that they've come up with the base. The real aircraft is of course mounted into the floor, so you have a huge range of motion and it moves, as opposed to just forward and backwards like a Cessna yoke or something like that. It actually rotates around that bottom point as well, and so does this one in your hands. Yes, the rotation point is a little bit closer because it's not on the floor, it's just here, but actually it works really well. It's very convincing. It's not, again, as heavy as the real aircraft. I would recommend, unless if you want it to feel like the real aircraft, you may, to your taste, you may choose to do differently, but I would put all the springs in. It comes with an optional extra spring. I've got all 4 springs to give the most resistance possible for the pitch, and that definitely works for me as reasonable. I like the pull. I think it's a good range. It feels to me like there's less forward range, so the pitch down range is less than on the aircraft, and also less than the pull range even on this yoke. That may just be an illusion. It's very hard for me to be able to measure that, but it feels like there's more range in the pull, and that's probably better. You don't actually spend much time pushing forward on a yoke in the real aircraft, just a little bit of pressure if you're flying out of trim or starting a maneuver or a descent or a TCAS, something like that. But the majority of the time, your rotation, your flare, and lots of your maneuvers like a go around would all involve pitching up like that, especially on a fly-by-wire aircraft like the 777 that has built-in counteracting effects for the pitch of the power pitch couple. 737 slightly different, but there we go. You have more pitching down needed on the 73 than the 777 and the 787. So overall for the yoke, lovely shape as well. I really like the design. It is of course 1-to-1 for the 787. It feels really good. I really like the feel of it. I can't complain. Everything falls naturally into place. It is actually a captain's yoke. You can of course use it either way. You could just put your throttle to the left and be a first officer, because what they have is an almost symmetrical yoke. So you have this button here which is replicated on this side, and then you have the hat switches here. Now there are slight differences. The hat switch on the left is click spotted, so it just clicks around, whereas this one is rather brilliantly an axis. It's like a little joystick on its own, so you can use it to smoothly control the view. It's not just a hat switch, it's an actual little joystick. I really like it. You could probably set it up to fly the airplane from if you fancy not bothering with the yoke. So there you go. So that's nice. There's a minor difference there. The other big difference that stops you potentially from using this as a first officer's yoke is that the trim switches are here on the left. And that is the pitch trim. They are vertical. This is an aileron trim switch, which is left-right, and that is done in a different way. You could reassign this to be your pitch trim, but I think that would be quite a challenge in my mind. So I've actually removed that from use at the moment. So yeah, I've got it set up as a captain's yoke, so left yoke, which is probably how most of you fly. It's how most flight simulator aircraft are set up by default. But there we go. You'll notice that the real 777 doesn't have an aileron trim on the yoke there or there. It just has a pitch trim, and that's the same for the 787. 787 doesn't use aileron trim at all. It doesn't have it as an option. The 777 has it, but it's hidden down here, and it's still not used very commonly. Even in the engine failure case, the rudder trim is used here, but the this is not used as an aileron trim. So I've actually changed the use of that and we'll move on to why I've done that and what I've set it to in just a moment. You also have a little gear toggle here, but it's literally just a toggle switch. It's not pull and push or anything fancy. It's very similar to the one on the Airbus TCA, just a little flick switch with a nice little casing on it. Nothing wrong with that. And then between them we have the two more axes that are just between. You can't quite see them off camera, but they're just two axes that are pretty much unused by me at the moment because I have the throttle set up. If you didn't have throttles, you could use those as your throttles potentially, or something else if you fancy it. So moving on, let's just talk briefly about how I have the throttle quadrant and what I think of it. So this is not a one-to-one scale of the aircraft. So this is also all metal inside. It feels really nice. I do like it. It is quite plasticky, slightly different plastic feel than to the real aircraft, which does feel a little more solid, but it's, like I say, good weighting, and for a flight simulator yoke I think it's really nice. This is a little bit different. Some things about it I really like and some things I dislike. So what do I really like? Well, I like the fact that the friction on the throttle axes is actually tuned. They say they've tuned it to match the real aircraft, and whilst I couldn't go that far, it feels close, and you know, they may have measured it and know exactly the right amount of force. To me it feels very good, but whether it's exactly the same, very hard to tell. But it is nice. It's a smooth, really smooth axis motion, and you can really fine tune it. You can see, if we look down on the throttles down there, you can see it very precisely moving the engines up and down. It's really nice. You can mismatch them and everything, so that is really nice. I can't argue with the friction they've put on it. Not as adjustable, I can't see a way to adjust it, but I'm very happy with it as it is out the box. You can see I've got two throttles set up, and then I've got the speed brake axes here. Now you only get three, and this is on something I don't like. 3 axes is not right. You need 4, don't you? So you need one for the flaps as well. However, I'll let them off for the simple reason that the flap lever on an aircraft is not usually on a sliding axis. It's a notched. So you can see here we have flaps at 5, and then they would jump to 1, then up. You don't position them granularly. So a sliding axis is not so good. So I'm not using the flap lever on this because I don't want to have to look inside to tell where the flaps are. What I've done instead is on the yoke, I've got this switch assigned, so I'll move it left to drop the flaps a stage. Down they go, 1 stage, so increase flaps 1 increment, and then the return, so moving it to the right moves them up. Now that's just how I've got it set up because I don't need an aileron trimmer, so for me it's more useful as a flap command switch like that. And this way I can look forwards and I can just set the flaps, and then I can see down on my ICAS display what I've selected and when they're traveling there. So that's really nice. But yeah, it's a shame that it doesn't have 4. It would still be nice to have that option, or to even have a detented flap lever on the right hand side here, but we don't. I could not face doing what they have in one of their pictures of having a throttle on its own in the middle, a flap lever on the right, speed brake on the left. Yes, it does give you all the functionality, but I couldn't do it. I just could not do it. It did not look good to me. So I much prefer having 2. You have each thrust lever is individual, so there's a left and a right with a auto throttle disconnect button on the side that does work really nicely. So you can press that to disconnect, and we'll see that in the air in just a moment. But something I'll show you while we're on the ground is the reverse. Now, on the real aircraft, the reverse levers are different to the Airbus. On the Airbus, you lift up the reverse levers, and then the throttles actually move back, and they simulated that on the Airbus TCA, which I have got here to show you. So on this, we have the Airbus style, which is where if I unlock it, there you go, where it sits at idle, and then you lift this latch for reverse, and then it moves into the reverse range, and then you adjust the reverse range here. Now this is different on the Boeing aircraft. What they do is they lift up the reverser, and it goes into idle reverse, and then you keep pulling further and further and further to get more and more reverse out of it, and that's how they do it. Now that's not possible with this setup. Whilst they functionally and visually have a pretty good representation with these little white levers, all they do, because they're loose for most of their range, they just pop it into max reverse. So you can see what happens to the PMDG. It actually, show you once more, you'll see it, there you go, that's the idle position, and then that's the normal forward reverse. So watch the ICAS, which you can't quite see, there you go. If you watch the ICAS and then the throttle, you'll see that I lift it up and I go click, and it goes to idle reverse. It's transitioning into reverse, and once the reverse is deployed, it will then increase, and you can increase it through max reverse. So this will always just go to max reverse. Not a problem, still useful, but there you go, that's what it would do. Using max reverse on a big, heavy 777-300ER is actually not as uncommon as it would be on a short-haul Airbus, where you'd use it quite rarely on these big long haul aircraft. It's actually a bit more common. You're trying to keep the brake temperatures cool because there's no brake fans on an airplane of this size. There'd be a lot of weight to carry around and a lot of wheels to have fans on, but there we go. So yeah, reverse is modelled. What we don't have is this toga button here. That's in the same position on the 787 and the 777, is not modelled. You'd have to assign it to a different key or a different button. You do have a lot of options though. Speed brake lever, however, works very nicely. You'll see it deployed there because on the Boeings, when you go to reverse, it will automatically deploy the speed brakes. But there we go, or the ground spoilers. So I'll just stow those. Now again, no detent for the armed position, but you can just move it back a touch, and that arms it, which is good. And then you can obviously deploy it as you see fit, and that's a more useful scale. Speed brake lever is used heavily on the Boeing 777 and the 787, so that's where I'd have that. Next, we have these unassigned buttons down here. So, sorry, they are assigned, but they're not labelled. These are used for autopilot command mode, so we'll see these in the air. But the first thing I can show you is the little selector here. Now, it looks just like the heading selector in the middle of the Boeing MCP. Pretty good. I like it a lot. What we can do is we can actually use this to set any of these three options: the speed, the heading, or the altitude. Now, this is really, really, really cool. You simply twist it round to the next gauge and then you adjust that one. So now it's on the heading track position, it adjusts the heading track window 272. Then I switched it to the right to altitude and it adjusts the altitude window. How neat is that? Something I've noticed is if you spin it too fast, it doesn't really register, it just does one at a time. Whereas if you do it a little bit slower but smoother, you can scroll through the numbers quicker, but just whipping it round doesn't really achieve much. There you go. Heading track, nice, yeah, works functionally, and then the speed window as well. Now, it is a heavy switch to change between. It does feel quite plasticky, and I am a little bit worried about its durability for the twist in between. It does quite a nasty crunch when I change it round, so I'm a bit worried at how long it will continue to do that, but we shall see. The heading select button, you can actually push in and then force it into heading mode, which I really like. So that forces heading select out of the autopilot system. And then I'm using these keys for different modes, such as flight level change for this one. This one on the bottom right is for setting the parking brake. I believe this one's set to altitude hold. Yeah, it is. So there we go. So that's all to come. So I'm just going to turn the flight directors off. I'm not totally set on how I've got it set up for now. I've got this one assigned to LNAV, by the way, so I push that. LNAV is armed. I haven't found the command key for VNAV, so I haven't got that right now. So there we go. Takeoff FMAs, Toga, LNAV, VNAV armed, and we'll have a V2 please of 166. So I'll just set this bug to my speed and set 166 in the window. There we go. Now for cameras, this is the interesting bit of having a little joystick here. Really nice and smooth, so you can move the camera around and then you can assign a key obviously to reset your view. Now they have a few different ones. They've got activate smart camera, and I use it to reset the view as well, but you then got this key for resetting. So smart camera will look in the right place, and then if I've been looking around, you can press that and it resets. Got a pause key for just pausing the simulator, pretty standard. And then you've got the change view key down here. I might move it, it's a little bit out the way, but then you can scroll around the beautiful airplane on the outside. All very nice. You can have an outside view for our control checks. And yeah, this is good stuff. They've done a good job. It's a great weight. Again, not perfect, but better than what I've had before. I'm using some Logitech rudder pedals still. I have not got the Thrustmaster ones. By the way, I've also plugged these in separately. So this yoke plugged in USB A, and as does my throttle quadrant. I believe there is a way to connect through each other, but I couldn't get that to work in my little time experimenting with it. So yeah, I might change the assignments, but for now, I actually quite like what I've got. You can also down here change this. This is on engine 1 and 2, and you can change it to engine 3 and 4. There's another similar button on the back. So that was if you could connect another one to the side. Then you have speed brake, throttle, and then flaps if you wanted. But I've also on the back you can change it to Xbox and PC, which is what I've got obviously set to PC. So there we go. Now we just re-engage our V-speeds, having messed around with the FMAs, and we'll get into the air. It does make you sit quite far back. You'll notice that I'm quite a long way, and I have quite a big monitor, 32-inch monitor, so you're going to need a big screen if you're going to use this on a reasonable sized desk. However, what I am pleased about is I was a bit worried that my desk would be the wrong height, but they've really got a good balance. This is my natural desk position, and they've got a good balance of how the mount actually brings the yoke down and forwards, so it's in I think a really nice place. It's a little bit higher than I would perhaps have the real one. It's very hard to tell. It seems a little bit higher to me, but it's not bad at all. Not bad. and you know, we're talking minor adjustments here. So with my normal chair position and desk position, I've raised my chair a little bit, and that seems to have helped. And you sit so far back, your knees actually get away from the desk anyway. So there we go. Right, let's get this 777 into the air. You can also assign a button to your toga button, I believe, on the PMDG. I don't have that done yet, but I'm just going to disconnect the parking brake. So I've got that assigned here. So press that. There we go. It's gone. And let's get ourselves underway. By the way, the trim is set at 4.75 down there. So we're going to spool up the engines 55%. Let's reset the position. I'll just look down a bit to show you the yoke. Bit of forward pressure. 55%. Press the toga button. There's thrust ref, toga, and we are moving. Around 80 knots, yoke to neutral. Looking down to the end of the runway, keeping it straight with the rudder pedals. There's V1. Rotate, and we'll get it moving. Nice and gently, much easier than I was doing with my Xbox controller. And rotating up towards the toga reference line, or the toga pitch flight director. It's rotated through a bit there, so we are a bit overpowered. Positive rate, gear up. We are very, very light for a 777-300. So you can see it's out of trim. I'm having to push forwards, but let's get that gear up and now pitch up to that flight director. Here we are in flight then with the autopilot engaged. So I have this button on the left here assigned as the autopilot disconnect. Once disconnects, feels nice. Once again to turn off the warning, so a second press, and then you can actually press it again to re-engage the autopilot. And there we go. Flaps are, as I said, on this switch, so I can raise and lower the flaps as I need to. So I can press it to the right and it will drop the flaps one notch. Sorry, drop it to the left. Now I have to remember which way around I got that assigned because I've done it the strange way. And there they come, the flaps start to travel out. So we'll just put those away. And if I disconnect the autopilot, go into flight director, there we go, and we can just fly the airplane around, and you can see the fly-by-wire trim. That's the blue gauge. That's not on the real airplane, but it just shows where the trim reference is for this aircraft, and I can move it around, and the airplane goes into trim for that position, so I can apply the pressure as I need to around it. So very nice, all pretty straightforward. Let's put the autopilot back in. There we go, and let the airplane do the flying, do the hard work for us. So what other modes have I got? Well, the autopilot. This is quite a neat feature. This is sort of like having your own little MCP. I think it's a really good idea. So if I want to put the airplane into heading mode, so heading cell, I can simply, I'll put it on heading track mode so I can adjust the heading. Let's bring the heading bar around. And again, like the other modes, you need to move it quite slowly or smoothly to get a faster result out of it than if you just whip it round. So let's go heading 220, and then if I click it, heading cell. So I had to play around a little bit with the commands to get that, but there we go, heading cell, and off it goes. If I want it back in LNAV, I can press that button, and that re-engages LNAV. Remember, that wouldn't work if you were too far off the magenta line, but it does work because we are pretty close. So there you go, those are the two lateral modes you're realistically going to use, and of course, final one you'd use is localizer or approach if you're flying an ILS approach. Next is the vertical mode, so let's swap over to the altitude window. Let's wind the altitude up. So let's put it up to 12,000 feet. And I can press this button for flight level change. No, tell a lie. I need to press this button for flight level change. There we go. Thrust, flip speeds, and up we go. We'll just set standard as we're going up to flight level. There we go. Thrust, flip speed, and up we go. Now that opens the speed window. So now if I move the dial over to speed, I can then choose. Oh, not heading, speed. There we go. So there you go. There's a trick. You've got to remember which one you have it last on, or check very carefully what you're maneuvering. So we, of course, always check which number's changing, and then we check again on the PFD to make sure it's gone in the right place. So we go 270 knots, thrust flip speed, so the plane will now try and climb at climb thrust whilst at flip speed. I can disconnect the auto throttle system. So if I was to disconnect like that, we lose the FMA for the throttle. Auto throttle disconnect master caution, that's fine. And now I'm controlling it manually, and the airplane will respond accordingly in flip speed. So whatever thrust I set, it would just try and maintain that speed, so by pitching the aircraft up until it intercepts the altitude. Pretty good. I've actually got them set to re-engage the auto throttle system if you need to, but you can just keep pressing it to clear the message. So if I'm in vertical speed and then I disconnect the auto throttle system, the airplane will still prioritize vertical speed, but then if I were to press AT, it would just re-engage the speed mode. So That's one way of doing it, but not something we do very commonly. You don't actually disconnect the auto throttle system in the 777 or the 787 very often. You're only going to disconnect it when you want to have a problem with it or something like that. Realistically, most of the time you're going to leave it in. Right, and there we go. Those are some of the modes that I have it set up for in flight. So like I say, I've got the flitch set because that's quite a common mode to use. I've got LNAV and heading select if I want them, because those are also more commonly used. I find it frustrating to scroll with the heading, I'll be honest. It takes a bit of time to get it all the way around. I don't think it's more frustrating than just using a mouse on the MCP up here, and also because it's a separate dial, the mouse can be a pain when you have a camera shaking around in turbulence or something like that, whereas at least this way you are moving it, but yeah, it can be a little bit slow. But otherwise I quite like this feature of being able to change all three just from this little dial here. It'd be nice if they had separate dials, but I'm not going to complain too much. I think it's quite a neat solution they've come up with that little changeover. However, the Boeing has so many vertical modes, we're still struggling to fit them all on. So the vertical speed mode is missing, and if I wanted maybe approach mode, I'd have to assign that to a different button, which I might do in the future. I might assign an arm approach button as opposed to one of these is set to heading hold. I think this one, alt hold, which is just a mode I've never used on the real aircraft. Alt hold is a way to just get the airplane to level off immediately wherever it is. Not used very often. Also, by default, instead of LNAV, it would actually go into heading hold, a mode that you again don't use very often. So I would rather have heading select and LNAV. Those are the two modes used far more commonly. You can see there, just going slower definitely wins the race when it comes to heading bug. Something I'm getting used to. I think I could get used to that. I must stress that I really like this hat switch being a joystick, so you can actually move it at normal speeds and then you can whip it around. Much nicer than having just click spots like this one does here, which just actually jumps to side views, which is not a bad way of using it. There you go. And then you release it, goes to the back. I quite like that. That's a good use of a hat switch like that. But now I've been treated to this little joysticky one. I'm definitely going to be using that more often. That is just great to have control over the sensitivity. I could even use that for some of my sort of filming shots that I do. Super, really super. It's just a shame, as ever, that the flight simulator puts the airplane too low in the window. I will stop whinging about that one day. So here we are on the Boeing 787. Now, of course, this is what it's meant to represent one-to-one. This is the aircraft I fly. So what do I think? Does this feel like the real thing? Well, it's good. It's really good shape. It obviously is not quite the same because the real aircraft does not have this second control sort of section on the top of the yoke handle. It just has one on the left or on the right if you're a first officer over there, and then the inside part of the yoke is just plain. But there we go. This allows us at least to use it either way and gives us crucially the extra controls we want, because we're in a flight simulator. We need more buttons than the real yoke, strangely enough, to have at our fingertips. The trim switches are different. They are weighted different. These are just clicky switches, so they just pop in one direction or back the other way, whereas the real ones are actually sort of a bit more springy. They move a little bit further. Minor gripe that. I mean, it's there's no issue using it like this. By the way, there's two so that you don't accidentally move one and send the trim running, so you have to use both, but there you go. You've also got, like I say, this is actually the HUD change switch. So this button on the top left, which you can see on the yoke here, in the 787, that's used for changing the HUD. It won't work on the ground, but you would declutter the HUD by pressing this button here, and it gets rid of these tapes on the side and puts a big horizontal line. So I use that for landing quite often, but there we go. In this setup, I've got this assigned, and what it comes as by default is the autopilot disconnect, which is fine. That's what it is. Now, the real airplane, this little button here is the autopilot disconnect, but we have that replaced by a hat switch for moving the camera around on the yoke. It's a reasonable compromise. I don't think it's a bad one. And then, of course, by having this second version, we have more buttons. So we have our view hat, and then we have the reset. I have this assigned to my reset view. I think that's most useful. And then you've got the smart camera on one trigger. And I meant to say there is a trigger on this side as well. On the real aircraft, these triggers, you don't actually have one on each side. You have just one on the left. And it's a rocker switch. So in one position, it puts the microphone onto the interphone, and then in the other position, you hold it down on the spring to transmit to air traffic control. So it's like a lot of airplanes, it's the transmit switch. So that's actually the trigger on the back of the yoke. Here we have one on each side. Again, you don't have one on the other side. The reason they're lopsided is because, of course, the idea is that your inside hand is going to be on the throttles, so your hand's going to be here on moving your throttles while your left hand flies. And they're very clever design. So you've got your trim switch, and then you can transmit, so you can trim the airplane, you can transmit to air traffic control, and you can fly with the throttles correctly. So yeah, that's how it's supposed to be set up. So some minor differences there, but like I say, in terms of feel and movement, it doesn't move forward quite as much as I think, although it's not bad, and it does have a large amount of travel, particularly in the upwards movement, and I think that's really nice. I can't complain. To fit that into such a small design and package, I think is really nice. Again, the weight, the real airplane's very heavy. I would put all the springs in the base. It is a little bit on the lighter side than the real aircraft, but I think the roll, once you get it up to the higher roll ranges, it starts to feel very close to the real aircraft, even if in the center part it is slightly lighter. But again, this is quite a thing to say, considering how much lighter a lot of joysticks are than the real thing. This is a really nice way to control an airliner in a simulator, even if it's marginally lighter than the real aircraft. I believe as well there are differences. For example, the Boeing 767, the 777 and the 78 all actually have different weightings to the controls. The 78 possibly being one of the heavier ones, but I'm not 100% certain on that. So yeah, very nice. As you can see visually, it looks great. They've got the colour right, obviously grey, not brown like in the triple. The only thing that I would have liked to have seen is the real aircraft. This is actually a clipboard, as you can see here. So this actually you can put your charts on or some notes or whatever. That is not modelled here on the real one. It's just a sort of fake, and I wish there was just a little clip on the top. I think that would have been nice. They do instead include this mount, so you can actually, if you want, pop this into the top, and then you could just mount your charts or your iPad or anything you want up there. Yeah, I won't probably be using that because I think it just gets in the way of my keyboard really. So there we go. So yeah, very nice visually, very nice weighting, and actually I'm quite surprised how much I like it. I like it more than I thought I would. Not sure if the heading bug works by default here. Yes, it does. So that's good. So I haven't had to change anything, and it works the same on the 787 MCP. So that's going to be handy for me. Oh, it's nice to be back in the 787, isn't it? And you can see here as well, visually, the throttles look more similar to these ones. And then you've got your little reversers there, which do work on this as well. Nice, very nice. Again, no range of movement, but they do move correctly. That's all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been interesting just to see a bit of a talk about what the Boeing Yokes are like and what this Thrustmaster TCA one feels like and compares to the real aircraft. So yeah, I think it's a rather fantastic product. I like it a lot. It is quite pricey. The full price for it is quite high. I did buy this with my own money, and yeah, it's quite an expensive bit of kit. But I've got to say, the money goes into that yoke with that pendulum feel. That is really where it's at. It's got a really nice feel to it, and it certainly is different to other products I've used on the market. It's quite rare to have a full yoke simulated in what is quite a compact size. So very, very impressed with that. Throttle system also quite clever, quite neat, although not my favorite in some areas. It has a lot of things going for it, and quite handy with the way you can use it for the Autopilot. It is missing, of course, any way of controlling the engine starts and that sort of thing, but still, I think that's a small price to pay for something you're going to use far more often, which again is that Autopilot. That's all then. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again in another video or live stream soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.